Okay, we're on.
Hi
All right.
there.
Hey everybody. SEMP 1001, and we're speaking today with
Elly Green.
Elly Green, yeah. Actually, Elly is one of my team members at the Centre For Social Entrepreneurship. So, Elly, what do you do when you're not having interviews with your colleagues?
Yep. So my current job is, or role at Georgian is the coordinator at the Centre for Social Entrepreneurship. And a key project that I'm working on is SENCO, and it's the Social Enterprise Network of Central Ontario.
Excellent. And so you obviously have a background because Susie, our director, thinks you're awesome. So let's talk about today. So we were talking about social entrepreneurship, some of our passions about this space. Tell us a little bit about your story, because I think what's crazy is we're both OCAD grads.
Yep.
Yeah, it's good. That's what you want to do, two OCAD grads in the same spot. Anyways, and what is that? What do you think that kind of means for sort of this sector?
Sure.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll start. I'll start after high school. So so I first applied to Fanshawe College to fashion design, and I actually moved to London and did the first semester in London, and I did really well, but I did not like the program per se, the kind of philosophy of moving forward with a fashion label, and I decided I wanted to pursue a broader creative education, and so I applied at OCAD, and I moved to Toronto. While I was in Toronto, I needed a part-time job, so I was hired on. Well, I had a friend who worked at a homeless shelter, and I was hired on to do frontline work at a men's homeless shelter downtown Toronto called the Gateway. And so what I did is I went to school every day, and I completed a sculpture major, and throughout the year I worked part-time at the shelter to pay my bills. And I think a big takeaway for me from my 4 years at OCAD was the pull between, I would go and work at a homeless shelter and support people going through kind of the worst crisis of their life, and then I would pack up from my shift and I'd go to OCAD and I would get to work in this amazing welding studio and make these amazing things that maybe would never sell or whatnot. So I was living this kind of polar, it was just like I was in two different worlds all the time, and I really loved that, I guess. It was really important to me to be doing work that mattered. So when I finished school, I'm just going on and on here. Do you want me to do that?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay.
But this is the story, right? Like,
Okay.
I mean, part of some of the things that we're talking about and these sort of things is, the piece that I was talking to me was that moment where you decided, the same thing happened to me as I was sort of going through, and I studied environmental design, right? So we were on the design side. And, we'd be doing retail design, and we'd be doing hospitality design, and then we'd be doing things like, okay, take a shipping container and make a community, a community hub. And I'd be like...
Right.
It's that dichotomy that we live in, and I think, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's that first seed that happens when you decide you want to make that pivot. And for some of us, we know right out of school, because we're living these stories of, okay, I got to go to school, I got to get this job, and this is, if you're in art or design, this is kind of where I'm going, and I have to go into sort of some commercialization of the industry to pay my bills. But then there's that other side of us where, okay, no one ever talked to us about, this kind of thing that, is there, what's your purpose? What's your existence, right? And so your story I thought was very compelling, because I think it really speaks to this concept of where do these social entrepreneurs come from?
Right.
When we spoke with Dan, he talked about this idea of these empathetic MBAers.
Yeah.
Right, and how, we were looking at empathy, and we thought we were empathetic, but we were just the most empathetic people in business, which was completely different than so this exploration of empathy and how does it articulate, because we're not taught it. So I think that mindset, as we meander through, it's such a key part of becoming a social entrepreneur. And our stories are really where we learn to contribute, and it's our own self-exploration.
Yeah, I would say so. Throughout my journey working in different not-for-profits, I'm always the most creative business focused, efficient staff. So I'm kind of the opposite, I guess,
Right.
or coming from the other direction. Yeah, which is really interesting. So
Yeah, like what is it that brings people with, we didn't say at 5 years old we're going to go out and be social entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Or it was just sort of like, okay, well, how did we find these values or found these positions that could check the boxes off?
yeah,
Right. It was more these questions like, well, I didn't like that so much, but I'd rather work in this. And, we don't really have this definition about what our career path is going to be. We just know that we really just want to affect change.
yeah,
And we might not even be able to articulate that, right? But
yeah.
I thought it was really cool when you told the story about your final thesis project,
Yeah.
about the Last Supper,
Yeah.
which is good.
So so as I went through OCAD, I guess I was pretty fortunate in my third year to tackle essentially kind of like a thesis project. I was commissioned to do this amazing metal piece, had the opportunity to get paid, and so I moved all through that and arrived at a place where I had essentially learned everything technically that I wanted to learn. So my thesis year, I ended up kind of exploring. It was a little bit more of an internal exploration of definitely my values, my history. I had a bit of a community Christian youth group history, so it was dealing with religious themes and dealing with social justice and working at the shelter and just kind of humanity in a big picture. So my fourth year, I created this book. I hand-printed sketches I did. It was all kind of a little bit random. And then what I decided to do, because I was in sculpture installation as my final piece, was to create a Last Supper. I guess side note, I grew up in the restaurant industry cooking. So I had worked in craft service and film and in a high-end restaurant. So I decided I was going to prepare a whole meal, did fancy sushi rolls, appetizers, the whole deal for my class of 20 people, and just set up this whole space for them. And the idea was for all of us as a class to come together, talk about what we've learned, where we are, and then for me to essentially say farewell to art moving forward. So that's what I did. And it actually did have a really big impact. Many of my colleagues, and it's been years and years and years, over a decade now almost, have said that piece was really insane.
It was almost like a manifesto, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is where I'm doing, right? This is
Yeah.
what I'm going to stand for. And at the time, you probably didn't know what
Yeah.
that meant. You just sort of said, you know what, I just got to take whatever I've learned from this experience. And
move on.
Yeah.
And so then I essentially finished that, and I started working full-time at the same shelter I was working at in an outreach position. So for 2 years, I worked in a role that was in partnership with the Streets to Homes initiative in Toronto, trying to work with homeless folks that are identified as extremely homeless, moving them straight into housing instead of through the shelter system. So I did that, which was it was actually an amazing job. I loved it.
so what would you learn from that? Like, what was sort of your big revelation? So that was purely a not-for-profit that you were working
Yes.
in, right?
So working in a not-for-profit, I think that in that position, I definitely was brought into contact with, the City of Toronto's agenda that was based on implementation of Streets to Home initiative in New York. So it was just big picture. I realized my little job working with, a handful of homeless guys. That's so loud. Guys, in the downtown East End of Toronto, actually was a part of a very big agenda. So, I know I'm on tape here, but a couple of things that were really interesting in that job was that we encountered some homeless individuals living in Toronto that I actually felt the homes that they had created were better than the homes we were offering them in apartments far out in Scarborough. So
that's interesting, right? So you're looking at this. So these guys they're living homeless, right, out in wherever, and it's kind of like this whole concept of architecture without architects, right?
Yep.
Like truly human centered. Like this is, and they're okay doing it, and you're going to offer them this institutionalized
box.
An
hour
here you go.
away.
We've saved you.
Yeah. So that
an hour away.
Yeah.
Like an hour away.
Yeah.
Oh my
From
God.
their home. So that was really interesting, and I think I guess some of our collective decisions to support some clients. To support some clients differently than was mandated, was probably like, I guess, a step for me in my own professional career in social service, to see actually you could do things a little bit different and start breaking some rules, but not for any other reason than for the actual humanity, the quality of life of somebody. So yeah, so then I guess I paused there. So I did that for 2 years, and then I was a volunteer coordinator at the same shelter for 2 years. I'm really going down the social service background here. We got to talk about social enterprise, but
yeah, but it's core,
leading
right?
up.
Like most of our students here are going to come from this background,
right?
Like how did you because here we are, we're blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
And you're identifying the inhumanity, you're identifying this and that, and you're like, well,
what am I going to do?
Yeah.
So,
I don't like this. What am I going to do about it?
Yeah, and so, I mean, to be honest, after the 2 years in that role, I was, you could say, a little bit burnt out because I cared a lot about that job and our clients. But so I transitioned. I mean, other factors were to play, and they needed somebody to fill the volunteer coordinator role. So I transitioned, and I was the volunteer coordinator for the shelter, and I supported, I forget, it was like 50 volunteers. I don't know, there was lots of volunteers. And volunteers from those on OW who needed hours filled to high-level donors. And then there was one really interesting group that came through. So we would be contacted by church groups and school groups who wanted to do street walks. So
what's a street walk?
A street walk is generally when you walk. It's a tour of homelessness. It's a tour of poverty. It's a walking tour to allow people to see the depths of challenge others are facing, generally. So, having worked my 2 years in outreach with getting to know all the guys on the street, you'd think that'd be something I was really up for doing. However, I was really against the idea of a tour to show those with privilege, those without. And if something like that were to happen, is this education, and what's going to happen next, and what's the whole point, and is this even a good idea? This is a terrible model. So this kept coming up, and alongside these requests, a guy that was on the street, his name was Squeegee. He used to squeegee at Spadina and Queen.
I think I probably had my window done by him at some time.
Most likely.
Yeah. Did he have a dog?
He didn't have a dog. A lot of the guys down there do have dogs.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, so Squeegee, Anthony. So he actually was kind of he was like what do they call it? He was like a class. Anyways, he was like one of the few people who came off the street, clean from crack, and was had his mental health and was able to begin a new life was his goal. So he was a part of our shelter community, and then also just super amazing personality, really charismatic and really smart. He wanted to work. So what I decided was I started talking to him about these street walk requests from folks, from the different groups, and I started asking him what he thought about it and whether he thought they were good or bad, or what was his position, or like could he ever imagine if he was on the street like a year ago and this happened and whatnot. And so what ended up happening was the two of us decided we were going to test out a possible model to do street walks together. So my role was I was coordinating it. Essentially the market demand was coming to me. People were asking. And I decided Anthony was the only person who could deliver this.
This is Squeegee?
Squeegee.
Squeegee?
Squeegee is the only person who could deliver this with the sensitivity required. So we started working together, and they were a real success. And we did tons of street walks, and it was interesting because a lot of funds started coming in because we would charge per person for these. So essentially, this was the first social enterprise-esque concept that I got involved in, I guess. And to date, the street walks continue, and to date, Anthony is still employed at the Gateway doing them. They've gone through all sorts of different iterations, I know, of change, and we ended up making a lot of money for a while, and just how the funds were distributed needed to change. because for a while Anthony he was making a lot of money, and I wasn't.
That's good.
I was getting paid my hourly rate, and he was making a couple $100 for 2 hours.
So that's when the customer becomes the beneficiary, or the beneficiary becomes the customer.
I know
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was really interesting. So it went through lots of changes and therefore obviously challenges and whatnot. But it was neat. It was a really neat process to consider making money, being within a charity, a social service, a shelter, an emergency response. It's a service to homeless guys, and then bringing in others and teaching them, teaching them about the challenges of the street from the actual person who has faced them. So it was pretty cool.
That's great. So that was sort of your first introduction to social enterprise. So then what happened after that?
I know, I'm really going on here.
No. It's good though. I mean, it's part of that storytelling that is so important in this sector, because I think really, I mean, the story when you sit in a boardroom and you talk to a corporation and they say, "How'd you do this year?"
Yeah.
And they put up a big chart on the wall and they say, "Here you go. This is how we did."
Yeah.
But in social enterprise, you would say, "How do we do this year?" Well, we raised X amount of money, but what's more important about is I want to talk to you about Squeegee and the impact that it made, and how important that truly is, where these collisions happen.
Yeah. I think that the impact, I guess, just going back to I'm just kind of like taking myself back there. The coolest part of those street walks was we would do a Q&A. We do the walk. Anthony was talking about different spots, Squeegee, Anthony, and then we do a Q&A at the end. And because of the personality that Anthony was and the personality that I was, we really focused on, bonding with the kids and letting them ask questions and not be afraid. And the Q&A were kind of those, there was always a goosebump on your arm moment where a kid asked something, or the answer that Anthony gave, there was always just a moment where it was like, whoa. And that would be, I would say, the social impact that was lasting.
The goosebump factor?
The goosebump factor that then you realize, whoa, like that kid just understood. That kid just learned something that they would never learn. And that was what kept me and Anthony doing them, not so much all the cash we were making. To be honest.
Right. So it'd be great to have on the dashboard. So we talked to Ellen from Sojo about impact measures, right? And Goosebumps, yeah. So on the dashboard side, you'd have the goosebump factor. I think that'd be a really great measurement.
I like it.
The goosebump factor. So what's your goosebump facter? That's how much money you'll end up with. But no, it's true, right? So we can get, I find that some of the things we're talking about and learning about social entrepreneurship and say, okay, let's contextualize it into a course.
Yeah.
You kind of get this sort of this is the box.
Yeah.
And you can also get away from this sort of, the reason why we're here is to humanize this concept of impact.
Yeah.
Right. And and that's why the storytelling side is so important.
Yeah. When
we talk about this, and that relates to sort of how we end up with partners and stakeholders and that kind of thing. It's because at some point somebody's got to plug into your, somebody's got to come through the door. They have to plug into something, and generally 9 times out of 10, it's always going to be the story.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think touching on our theme of relationships and partnerships, it's interesting because the only way that initiative could have started is with the pre-established relationship that Anthony and I had as staff and client, and then coworkers. And without that kind of element of trust, looking at him as a beneficiary per se, who then was employed, he also brought, I think, all the value to that. It's interesting because if that relationship hadn't existed, we wouldn't have explored the ideas and come up with an idea and piloted it and all of that. So that's also really interesting, I think, about that initiative.
That's cool. So it was really interesting. So you Quentin, and you got into this interesting discussion, and I couldn't unfortunately stay for it, was this concept of, do you think that a social enterprise should hire the beneficiary? Right?
Yeah.
So that was an interesting conversation. So what did you guys talk about? So what was, because so Quentin asked you this question.
Yeah.
And we kind of were on the same page.
Yeah.
But so let's go back. Can we go back to that? Because that was a really good conversation that I missed out on.
Yeah. So Quentin said, what do you think? So within social enterprise, there's a whole spectrum, and from one side to it could be not-for-profit to for-profit, why are you doing the social enterprise, and what is the requirement of the beneficiary involvement? So, so I said, I think a social enterprise cannot have the beneficiary directly involved. However, and he was surprised I said that. However, I think that depending on the impact you want to have, if you want to have a specific kind of impact, the beneficiary has to be involved. What I'm trying to say is you can run a business and it can be, environment, whatever. I'm not going to pick on environmental because I love them, but so say it's an environmental organization, new technology, new whatever, it has great good, and you make all this money and you decide you're giving back to whatever charity. That's huge. You could be giving back millions of dollars to that charity. So the change that you're providing is financial. Essentially, you're giving funds to something else. Whereas when beneficiaries are involved in a social enterprise, that's where I feel the impact goes much further, because the impact becomes personal, becomes that person's life. So if a beneficiary, for instance, Anthony, who we just talked about, he was then hired. This opportunity gave him employment. There's so many other things he gained from that, but it actually changed his life. And I think that the idea with social enterprise is that it's change-driven impact. And what is that impact? I think an impact when you're working with social enterprises with beneficiaries is to that person, to the beneficiary. And quite often that's harder to measure. And I think it's a much more challenging type of social enterprise, because you're working with somebody who's marginalized, or whatever barriers they're facing, you're working with them as they're facing those barriers. So it's just a different model. And I do think it's the model, it's my preferred model. I think it's the one that people, if they have the courage to seek after, should seek after that one. But it's definitely the hardest.
Yeah.
So,
cool.
Yeah.
So what are you doing now outside of? So you came to SENCO. So I'm just going to jump ahead.
SENCO. Yeah, let's just jump ahead.
Well, but there's
or maybe I should jump at Sketch.
But I think there's some.
SENCO.
Yeah, wherever you want to go, because I think there's some. So you're burgeoning this awareness on you can actually make money.
Right.
in this and help somebody.
Yeah.
So this is an awareness. It's like an awakening. As you're starting to see this unfold, right? You just didn't sit out and say, "Oh, I'm going to start a social enterprise." You sort of of fished into it, right?
Yeah.
And then what happens?
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to go in chronological order and just touch on two things. I'm going to touch on. So I finished my time at the homeless shelter because I did kind of get burnt out. And I decided I needed to go back to my creative rooting. And as an entrepreneur, I started an eco-local clothing line called Clothing Brand Experiment. And I was joking with Nicole. It was my first like self-employed entrepreneurial business startup, and there's lots of mistakes I made.
We all laugh because we know.
So
that's why we're here. No, just kidding.
So many successes, but so many failures, but so many. Anyways, looking back on it now, you know what? I wanted CBE, Clothing Brand Experiment, to be a social enterprise, but I didn't know what a social enterprise was back then. And I set it up as a not-for-profit, but I wasn't hoping to make profit. I just wanted there to be clothing that was manufactured in Toronto, available for people to purchase, because that's what we should be buying. Local, quality, awesome goods. I wanted those to exist in the world. So an interesting tie here to just kind of go with the journey. I did CBE for 5 years. And when you talk about partnerships and relationships, the core success of that business was all of the collaborations I did with artists. My own personal creative network from OCADU was just how so many of the people involved in the success of that business.
Well, and that would have been important too, because, as much as, we talk about more the marginalized community, we talk about ecosystems, but this concept of art and innovation comes from the core of creativity in our artists.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, that giving that platform to come out is intensely important for the creativity for innovation to happen in communities, right?
Yeah.
You know, so that's kind of just hitting on a whole other spectrum of things. But unfortunately, you do it on your dime.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is fine. But you're right. It's that kind of whole, like, I love it, I hate it, I love it, I hate it.
Yeah.
I made a win. Oh, wow, that was a bad fail. But, you know,
Yeah.
so that's kind of cool. So anyway, sorry.
No, yeah.
But
And while I was at CBE, I set up CBE as a for-profit, and then I wanted to apply for some grants to do some really interesting projects with other organizations, and realized you can't do that as a for-profit. But to go around that, I did end up doing a couple of different granted projects in partnership with other nonprofits and charities. So it was really great. Did some work in that way. In my time, both throughout my whole journey that I've talked about in Toronto, I connected on and off again with an organization called Sketch Working Arts, who works with marginalized and homeless youth in Toronto, and they believe that art can transform the lives of those folks. So when I was at OCAD, I volunteered. When I was at OCAD and at the Gateway, I volunteered. I did a hoodie making workshop. I hemmed clothes for folks there. Did a few things like that. When I closed down CBE, I volunteered on a working group there. I also donated a bunch of stuff when I closed down my company to Sketch, and I just had different types of involvement with them. And then I was employed by them to launch their first social enterprise when they moved into a new legacy space at Artscape Young Place. So that was really a cool opportunity for me. And once again, I guess we're talking about relationships and partnerships. And I think a big part of why I had that opportunity is because I was in, you know, I knew them. They were a relationship I had developed, and they had gotten to know me, you know, my creative background, my business background, and my work in social service. So so that was a big project, and there's so many learnings I could share there regarding working with an organization who wants to start a social enterprise, and then actually being the person to execute that, and the challenges that come about, as well as the successes, because the social enterprise is now called SpaceShare, and it's inexistent and it's successful. So that's something that I'm really actually excited about. So
that's cool. So what would you say was like the craziest thing that ever happened? So you had an idea, because we've all got those, you know, like we've always got we got this crazy idea, and it's either going to go one way, it's going to just like crash and burn.
Right.
But we don't know that yet. We're going to try it. And then we've got wow, I'm just going to whatever. And then it goes, wow, I didn't think that would happen.
Like it worked.
Yeah, it's more like, oh my God, it worked.
It happened. It actually happened. Yeah, let me think. Okay, well, I think that like challenge-wise, like what was the biggest challenge? So as I mentioned, having been the creative business type person, always in the not-for-profit, somebody I like numbers, and I love, you know, capturing data, and have had an entrepreneurial spirit and creative kind of education. Being that person and knowing Sketch and having worked with them, before I started, I was just like, we are ready to go. I'm working with the coolest organization, about to do the coolest project. This is amazing. And then I realized when I started that, you know, there was a lot of support for these next steps, but there was also a lot of change happening in the organization. And, you know, there was some resistance to this next step of making a ton of money and booking out. So it's SpaceShare is a facility rental. Sketch has essentially like a mini art school, and the reason they moved into this fabulous space, there's dance studio, music recording studio, ceramic studio, commercial kitchen, project studio, woodworking studio. They moved into this space because they wanted and felt that marginalized youth should have access to arts facilities just like any art student. So this is something I really stood behind. I agree, they should. Sketch works with all sorts of smaller organizations, youth-led organizations who need space, and there was no space available for Sketch or these organizations to book out. So Sketch said, you know what? We're going to plow ahead, we're going to secure the space, and we're going to make it available for the people we want. So fully in support of this mission, I also knew that 4 days of the week, they were going to need to rent it out to others to make the money to keep the space. So so that just seems like, okay, no problem. Everybody would be okay with that. But if you think about like even just if somebody gave you a home and said, this is your new home, but just so you know, you can't be here on the weekends because we need to book it out for Airbnb. So you just like, it's closed. You can understand how you'd maybe be like, I'm not okay with this. And also, can you lock all your belongings in this cupboard because I don't want anyone to steal them. So there was a lot for me to learn on the pushback against social enterprise and the challenge within a not-for-profit to move something like that forward. And yeah.
So what were some of the conversations you had to have? Because this is a huge, like,
it's a huge thing.
This is a huge thing. Like, people don't realize, like, okay, great, methodology is great. Well, come on, blah, 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 this is how we're going to do it. Here's the plan, here's the social business model, canvas.
Yeah.
We know what we're going to do, and I'm going to hand it over to my board of directors or my executive director, who's like, WTF, like...
How am I going to do this?
Like, first of all, we're not a business. Right? This is what we do. And you're like, yeah, but this will get us to this. And they're like, yeah, no.
Not
like,
doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely, well, I think one of the biggest takeaways or bits of recommendation I would give to any not-for-profit in this situation is that Sketch knew me. So the directors, the executive director, and a handful of the staff knew me.
Right.
So I had a relationship with them and trust developed. Now, and I was the champion who was going to lead the social enterprise development. I would say that the hard part is there was a lot of people who didn't know me. And so why would they be excited about these next steps and why would they trust me? So I always say, and I have said as Sketch has been developing other smaller social enterprises, that the champion needs to come from the team. So if you want to develop a social enterprise, hire the person you think is going to be the champion for that and have them run the program or work alongside your program team or whatever you're doing that's serving your mission before you have them jump in and launch the social enterprise, because it will help you a lot with the resistance and the buy-in you need. Right. So that's one thing that was really apparent to me. However, it just meant a little more time and a lot of conversations and a lot of discussions. And I think also as a social enterprise, you need to realize when you're talking about your impact and the value you're bringing, you got to look at who you're talking to. When you're talking to the treasurer on the board of directors, he's going to want to know different information than when you're talking to one of the frontline staff working part-time supporting a program. They want to know the value you're bringing to what they're doing, and both of them in totally different perspectives. So I think it's really important as a social enterprise developer, lead, champion, to be able to talk about the measurement in completely different ways: financial, social, and to be able to have the story side. The social side isn't just a number. It isn't 10 hours are available to you. It's, because of what we're doing, here's what you now can do with your program, or here's how we're supporting you, or tell me what kind of support your program needs so that we can ensure the social enterprise can help do that,
Yeah. So.
It's
really, you really need to understand how, like, the accounting is a really great example because a lot of those discussions start there. And I've always found, like, in my experience, or even when you're trying to sell creative ideas into for-profit, right? Like this translates across both these sectors when it comes down to when you talk to finance, because everybody loves CFOs.
Yeah.
They're awesome.
Yeah.
They are in their CFO world. And so trying to break into that world, it really truly is how do you give the art of the story about, okay, so, is the conversation about value? Mm-hmm. Is the conversation about profit? What are those things? They're intrinsically different. And then in the social enterprise world, you have to be able to kind of smash that into a conversation around, okay, so our mission is to do this, and it costs us X amount of dollars to do this. So if we do this over here, and we bring value to the organization, it's actually going to make us money, and it's going to give us our mission statement.
Yeah.
And those are very different conversations to have, and part of that I always found was a learning. So I had to learn how, this person's doing this, and then and that's what's great about being creative is we can adapt and we can morph and we can, figure out, okay, oh, that's what you mean when you say that. It's kind of like when we were just talking about, right?
Yeah.
This concept of fiscal sponsorship.
Yeah. Totally.
Right?
Yeah.
This idea that, we're pitching this idea that, okay, so you're starting a social enterprise, you don't know what structure you want to incubate under. Is there somebody out there already that could financially sponsor you? And what we mean by that is, could they lend you their charitable number?
So you can get a grant.
So you can get a grant.
Yeah.
And the question would be, well, why would we do that?
Yeah.
Right?
We definitely want to do that. And I
Yeah.
think it's really important. It's the same idea of any entrepreneur. They need an opportunity to launch, to incubate, to launch. After that, to get feedback, to get mentorship, to get financial backing in whatever capacity that is. And in our world, it's probably a grant. So
yeah, well, that's our startup, right?
Yeah.
Unless you get social impact investors, right? Which here we're growing them.
Yeah.
Right? Seeing the value of, a lot of that changes too with economies, right? Like how, the major accounting firms evaluate sustainability, right? Like they put a line item now, right? In terms of investment, like you should invest in this company because they have a sustainability statement, right? It might be a vanity play, but it's kind of like what Interbrand did in the 70s and said, the value of the company is not necessarily in terms of the actual infrastructure and the staff. It's actually in this brand value, right? And I think this is the era of the social value coming in, and how are we measuring it? So Interbrand was able to develop a framework now by which they could rank and measure brands, and that's now how they're evaluated.
Yeah.
And maybe in the future, in sort of this new sector, this concept of social enterprise, we'll be able to say to the CFO, it's like, well, our social value is X, which means we're worth Y. Yeah. Right?
Yeah, and the SROI, I know that's kind of being fine-tuned by all different...
So social...
Internationally,
Yeah, so social return on investment.
Yep.
Yeah.
I can say for SpaceShare, so SpaceShare at Sketch, SpaceShare is the social enterprise, the facility rental. I did do a lot of exploring of how are we going to measure our impact and what is what is the purpose of what we're doing, or just like how to really break that down. It was easy to say we rented this many hours and we made $50,000 in 2 quarters. It's just that was really clear, and we did all of that within the time block allotted to us. But we started exploring with what value were we giving back to Sketch and to marginalized youth, emerging youth who need creative space. And so Sketch has a lot of partners, collaborative partners, emerging youth who are actually writing grants in the same model that we just talked about, fiscal sponsorship. And so every time we worked with a partner of Sketch, that became our target, or not our target, but our main client, our priority client. And that was not the highest paying client, because that priority client was also the client we gave 25% discount to, no matter what, and maybe a little bit more if they needed it. So it was interesting because we had to have a conversation of, we just received a conference request booking and they're going to pay us $4,000 for the weekend. However, we also just received an event request for a partner, and they want to do this. It's a deliverable for their grant, and we will make $300. And so we had to make those decisions, and I had to create a map so that we knew why we were making what decision. And in that situation, it was the partner. You had to take your business money-making hat off and go, I'm not going with that contract because the purpose of what we're doing is to support the other one. And then at the same time, though, we measured the amount of discount provided to all of our partners. So we could say at the end of this quarter, we provided $5,000 in discounts to our partners. So that was our own kind of sponsorship of them through this social enterprise. So there was neat ways to kind of measure the opportunity and to creative space we were providing. So and then there was also lots of stories and also opportunities for this booking to be in the space and another booking to be on the other side of the space, and for them to meet each other and go, wow, you're doing this and I'm doing that, let's collaborate. So it was definitely the purpose of Sketch's space is to be a hub where people come together and can work together. So yeah.
So my business had asked me, could you write that $5,000 off?
Right.
As sponsorship dollars.
I know,
for
right?
CR, like, because
Yeah.
you can write certain amounts. I mean, I'm not, if there's any accountants in the room, I might get slaughtered by that comment, but that concept, again, that business concept, right? Okay, so we wrote off $5,000 and that now becomes a marketing line item as opposed to an operations line item.
Yeah.
And, it's just some of those kind of, like, that kind of, you don't know how do we do this, right?
How do you make it all work? And we ironed out the, like, what elements of impact we were going to measure as our social impact, and then what ones would be financial, and then we started reporting on those. We also, whenever we would allot extra time to sketch programming or other partners because they needed more space to complete what they needed to do, and it was within our rental time block. When we started, we'd say, hey, yeah, absolutely, we're gonna book this at no cost because this is part of our own organization. Sketch is the organization. The purpose of the social enterprise is to support it. And if you need to complete this, we're going to give you that time. And so we also started measuring the amount of hours we were giving back to the organization. And, you could look at that as a loss, or you could look at that as a win. So for us, it was like, great. We are able to meet our targets for each quarter and provide these many hours at no cost back to sketch programming to complete what they need to do. So yeah, it's neat.
Yeah. It's business, right?
Yeah.
It's just where's your priority, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Motivation.
Yes.
Yeah. Motivation.
Yeah.
So cool. So so who are your partners at Sketch? Like, what would you consider a partner? Obviously the individuals coming in, right?
Well, there'd be the participants, and then there'd be Sketch had platforms and collaboratives. So those are the two names they have for those that are under the umbrella of Sketch. So those are projects and initiatives that emerging youth have reached out to Sketch to complete. So that would be, two youth who've emerged from Sketch programming, or maybe only one has or whatnot, and they want to do an audio program Tuesdays for 5 months. So they come up with this whole program, what they think would be valuable for the community they've come from. They put it together, write a grant. They get the grant. Sketch would support them, and they'd execute that project. So Sketch has a ton of those. Maybe not a ton, but like 10 to 20. Depending on the year, depending on I guess the session and. So I was aware of a bunch of them, and they were our key client to support. Sketch also, Sketch has been in existence for just over 20 years, so they are a real key organization serving youth with arts programming, and they have all sorts of partners. They have partners across the whole city, across the province.
And the partners provide referrals? Do they provide?
I guess partnerships. It's funny, actually, we talked as we were establishing this model of who gets a discount and who doesn't, and we had to go, who is a partner? What is the definition of partner?
Yeah.
So it is a big question. And anyone could be the partner if you're working together. Would be one way to look at it, but specific financial tied partners to Sketch were the collaboratives and partners. And then there was other organizations within the city who were looking to serve the same community, and they'd work together or pursue art. So it's like there's too many to even go on.
So it's really just social enterprises. We talk about customer, beneficiary, stakeholder, partner.
Right.
It really is based upon going back to the theory change and what your mission is that defines who falls into those sort of categories.
Right. So this is where, I was talking about Sketch. Let me talk about SpaceShare, the social enterprise.
Okay.
Because SpaceShare, the social enterprise, did have key partners. Sketch's organization and the facilities that SpaceShare rents out is in Artscape Young Place. So Artscape was a huge partner to us. That relationship was just critical in establishing. They had a flex studio rental program as well in the same building, different spaces. So essentially customers would be coming to the building to rent out space, and you could look at them as a direct competitor, or you could work together. So the I forget the role's name, but anyways, essentially the person who managed any of the rental inquiries, we started working together because there were differences in our space. If they had a booking come through that wanted to book their flex studio, but they actually wanted a kitchen, we had a kitchen, and we had an amazing commercial kitchen. So we started actually working together to ensure they could take any bookings that needed any of the spaces we had, and vice versa. We actually did some events that were within their spaces and our spaces. So it was cool. So it was a way to essentially, it was a choice. Are we going to work together? Or are we not going to work together? And working together proved more benefit and more rental bookings for both of us, which was great. So.
Well, and you're starting to see that a lot too, because Dan talked about that with the furniture bank and 1-800-JUNK.
Right.
We had that conversation. So, on their social enterprise side, they make their money from the pickups, which puts them in direct competition with 1-800-JUNK.
Right.
But instead of being, okay, well, we're competitors, why don't we have a conversation on collaboration? And I think that's what really truly the sort of the not-for-profit sector brings to this space is, in corporate culture, you don't collaborate unless, there's collusion.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
We need to keep this guy out, right? Or keep this girl out. Whereas, the thing I liked about coming into this sector was more, let's have a conversation. Let's just lay our cards on the table.
Yeah.
Because really, anything that we could possibly do is going to benefit our beneficiary.
Yeah.
It's a totally different mindset. It's sort of like if you've got something that's going to help us or help our client, our end goal is the benefit of the client.
Yeah.
And I find that's a very different conversation. And when you start to open that door, in terms of the partnership relationships, you really end up, it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Right? But everybody has to come to the conversation, come to the table, move past their vulnerabilities, and be honest and authentic, right? And I think that starts with the individuals that are sort of running it.
And I do think that, obviously money, everybody's approach to money, it plays a big role in this.
Yeah.
And when social enterprise activity starts leaning more towards financial return, and this happened to us in Spatier when we were starting out, we started leaning more on the financial side. As we were in startup phase and we started making significant amounts of money, we pushed pretty hard and then realized what had happened. We had captured a market. We had started bringing in revenue, and it's so easy to follow the money, right? Mm-hmm. So I think in a social enterprise, the check and balance that you need to have is almost daily. Like I said, with those 2 rental bookings, you need to set up criteria and you need to know what you're doing, because every day you're going to be challenged to pursue financial gain over social. And I think that's the biggest challenge.
And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with the pursuit for financial, but it's like you say, it goes back to the theory of change. So all organizations, and that's why the theory of change is such a major project in this course, is because everything we talk about doesn't matter what we do, whether it's your articles of incorporation or your charitable articles or your business model. It goes back to what's our goal?
Yeah.
What are we doing? If we do this, then this must happen. And how are we measuring that? And, for the grants, it's intrinsically important. And that also goes back to stakeholders too. So if you've got a board of directors or you have investors, bringing those investors in so that they have this common value to understand that is so important, because you're right. You're going to get into those financial conversations, right? Yeah. I've been on boards too where, childcare centers, not-for-profit, and they bring in a new program, and the first question that gets asked by the treasurer, are we making money? And it's sort of but.
Yeah, at Sketch I was really fortunate because when I started, there was a social enterprise committee, and I worked really closely with them because they were the stakeholders that I needed for feedback. I needed to run ideas by. I needed to consult over issues I was facing. They are why the social enterprise and the success I had to establish it. They are the foundation for that. And on that committee were key people: the executive director of the organization, the treasurer, who is just an amazing individual, and a couple other like serious leaders in the business world. Marketing, she was a marketing director, and a young but senior position at Manulife. People who really understood business, but also wanted to be at Sketch and wanted to iron out how are we going to create a social enterprise and iron out the social impact and make sure the initiative supported what the whole point of it was, the purpose of creating it. So their support was really critical.
Yes.
And
it's like you need to find a community of compassionate builders.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
That they're building this because they truly want to build something that makes an impact. It's compassionate. It's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
But they're not going to, they're not charging in for the sake of change. They're charging in for the sake of sustainable change.
Yeah.
Right. So that whole quadruple bottom line.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
So we're like, this has been an amazing chat. I hope it's been worthwhile for you too to sort of
absolutely.
kind of go back into your past and sort of tell your story. And there's been some just some incredible stuff that you've shared, just about how you've built and you sort of meandered in through that. Is there anything you want to give to somebody that's sort of in your position and they're tackling, okay, I want to do social enterprise. We're seeing social enterprise as a great way to go. What would be your advice to give these guys?
So on the business side, I'd
girls.
say feel free to contact me at SENCO and I can support you.
There's the business pitch.
The business side is you can reach out to me at any point, because SENCO will be a social enterprise and we'll be offering exactly what not-for-profits need, and some will be free and some will be at a cost. However, I don't know, outside of that,
So SENCO is the
SENCO, Social Enterprise Network of Central Ontario. This fall, a site will be up. But otherwise, I think that, partnerships and relationships and social enterprise success, I think that, like I just mentioned, the Social Enterprise Committee, relationships, that my history with the executive director and directors at Sketch and their trust and faith in me as the champion, these are just really important components of being able to move a social enterprise forward, which, if you break that down, that's asking an organization to take new risks, to take big new risks. And if you're going to go through that journey, you just need to know there's some people that you're going through this journey together, and that you're all there to help each other, to iron out the challenges and keep moving forward. So I don't know.
Like-minded people, trust.
Yeah.
It's all risk, take risk. You need risk takers. And,
make a little money.
Yeah, make a little money. And you know what? The people that start it may not be the people that sustain it. I'm a big believer in there's builders, there's starters, there's builders, and there's sustainers. Yeah. And you and I, we are not sustainers.
Starters.
We're starters. Yeah, we're starters.
Developers.
Yeah, and risk takers.
Risk takers.
Yes. That's good. Awesome.
Okay.
Well, thanks, guys. This has been awesome, and thank you, Elly.
Thank you.
This is great. I get so excited having these interviews because I learn so much too. So hopefully, I'll see you guys on Blackboard. Yeah.